I know how people in academia think, and they are literally locked in. It's like a religion to them. It literally is. It's the religion of evolution, and it doesn't matter how much evidence there is against it. They're locked into their system.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creation Podcast, where we discuss the science that confirms Scripture. I'm your host, Trey, and I have with me Dr. Jeff Tompkins, geneticist. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Tompkins.
It's great to be here.
Good. All right. How are we feeling today?
Feeling okay.
Okay.
I could have used a little bit more sleep last night, but we'll give it a go.
That's right. We'll see what happens, and it'll be great. All right. So I want to talk to you about biological evidences for creation. There's a lot. This is going to be actually a 2-part series. So for our listeners and viewers, we'll have several of those evidences in this episode, and then we'll have some more in the next episode. So come back for part 2. All right. So according to the biblical account, and according to ICR's beliefs and the young earth creationist belief, Earth should be around 6,000 years old. That's what we get when we just, from a plain reading of Scripture, we get 6,000 years old with life being present just a couple days after the beginning. Am I correct after that?
Yeah, so absolutely that's true, because the chronologies and genealogies in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, go back to 6,000 years from the present point. So about 6,000 years ago, the creation week took place. And that is when all biological life was created during the creation week, about 6,000 years ago.
Okay. Well, evolutionists say something entirely different. Evolutionists believe that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, and that life began about 3.5 billion years ago. Does that seem in line with what they're saying now?
Yeah, that's still what they're saying.
Okay.
And of course, that also presents the big problem of the origins of life.
Right. Where did it come from?
3.5 billion years ago, and they have never solved that or even come close to solving it. And James Tour is a specialist in that area, the origin of life, and then debunking, the evolutionary claims that somehow life popped into existence magically. The first biomolecule somehow came together magically. The first cells somehow magically came together. There's no evidence for any of it, even though scientists have tried to create these primitive Earth conditions and create these molecules and even cells. There was one guy who actually took a beaker full of proteins and lipids and nucleic acids and thought he could dump them into a mud puddle and create a cell. And he was actually surprised he couldn't create a cell, and he was actually a famous scientist that did this. So there is no evidence for the origin of life, but yeah, supposedly it occurred 3.5 billion years ago.
Okay. So if life is that old, then we should see evidence of its age, whether it's old or whether it's young. I mean, we can see whether something is old or young, right? Biologically speaking.
Well, as far as that goes, scientists would probably look at the fossil record.
Okay.
And when that actually started, which would be the Cambrian, maybe a little bit of Precambrian, but the boundary is a little bit fuzzy there.
Gotcha.
But supposedly, yes, and that's what really I want to talk about is the problem of the fossils and how they speak to a young creation and not an old Earth.
I think that this is an important topic. It's probably good to lay the groundwork of why we're even talking about this in the first place. Because if life is as old as the evolutionary theory posits, then I think that allows us to call into question other facets of the Bible. Like if the Bible is wrong about the age of the Earth, then who's to say that it's not wrong about everything else, right? But what you're saying is that there is evidence that life is young and that is anathema to what the evolutionary theory states.
Yeah, exactly. So let's start, where life first appears, complex life in the fossil record, and that's the Cambrian.
Okay.
So as creation scientists, and also taking into account creation geology and creation paleontology, we can look at the Cambrian and see life complex life appearing suddenly in a huge diversity and array of creatures. But most importantly, regards to the age of the Earth, we actually see soft tissue in the Cambrian. So we see tube worm fossils with pliable material in the worm casings that they put these little tubes they built in the sand. Their little houses they live in is still there. It's still present. It's soft. It's pliable. What's it doing there if it's supposedly, 450 million years old?
Right. If it was that old, it would have decayed, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it would have completely decayed. But it's exactly what we would find in a global flood because Dr. Clary, who works for ICR, who is a geologist and actually worked for the big oil company for a while, mapping out geological sequence, he showed that the Cambrian layers were the initial layers laid down in the flood. And so that's exactly what we ought to see as marine creatures, and that's what we see in the Cambrian is a huge diversity of marine creatures, including tube worms that were actually living on the bottom of the ocean. So that's why they appear at the lowest layers of the Cambrian. But think about other creatures as well, like starfish and brittle stars and horseshoe crabs. We see those in the Cambrian, and they're still alive today. I mean, their fossils actually have disappeared for millions of years, but they show up again living, in the oceans today. And so what happened is those creatures were buried initially in the flood. And then as the flood progressed, it began burying creatures in other locations of the ocean. Eventually the floodwaters hit land and started burying land creatures and land plants and things like that. So, but when we look at the fossils, they definitely speak to a very young Earth and that they were buried about 4,500 years ago in a global flood.
Right. And it's not just Cambrian or Precambrian. It's like we have found soft tissue in so many fossils at this point, right?
Oh, we found soft tissue in virtually every layer of the geologic column. Okay. And in fact, Dr. Brian Thomas has cataloged over 120 papers documenting soft tissue and biomolecules in fossils throughout the geological column. And most of these are secular papers. In fact, I think nearly all of them are secular academic papers. They weren't published by creation scientists. They were published by people in the conventional scientific community.
Okay. So I guess that brings me to what do those in the conventional scientific community, what do they say about this? How do they explain it away, or do they even try? Do they have some sort of you would think as a creationist, if I saw that, I'd be like, maybe I'm wrong, but surely they're not doing that. Maybe they're not saying, oh, maybe it is younger. What are they saying about it?
Well, really, they're just saying, these are anomalies. Oh, hey, we were wrong. These molecules and tissues can last for millions of years.
Okay.
Even though, it's absurd that they would have actually degraded by then. Studies have been done showing how fast proteins degrade, DNA degrades, tissues degrade, and they don't line up with what we're seeing within the evolutionary mindset or the evolutionary paradigm of deep time.
Okay. Gotcha. That makes sense. So biological evidence number one of a young Earth is that we have soft tissues, and it runs the entire fossil record from what's supposedly the oldest to the newest, right? So that points to a young Earth, correct?
Oh, exactly. And, kind of the rock star of that whole soft tissue biomolecule discovery movement that's actually still going on and actually picking up steam was the discovery of soft tissue in a T-Rex femur by Mary Schweitzer. Mm-hmm. And actually the Smithsonian called it Mary Schweitzer's dangerous discovery. And the reason it was dangerous was because it questioned the deep time of evolution.
Right.
But she actually found blood vessels and soft, stretchy tissue, collagen proteins, even found blood cells inside blood vessels that were intact. And this is all published in the scientific literature, the conventional secular literature that's out there. And so that was probably the most widely known example of it. But actually, as I said, there's been over 120 papers published in that particular area, and most of them don't get a whole lot of press.
Of course, they're not as
for
exciting.
obvious reasons, because
Yes.
they call into question the evolutionary paradigm.
Okay. Well, that's good. So, viewers, listeners, Biological Evidence 1, if you're arguing with your friends, don't argue with your friends about this like so adamantly. But if they have questions, you can point them to this. Be like, hey, there's soft tissue in dinosaur fossils. I know a lot of people don't know about that. Okay. Biological evidence number 2. I have read that they've actually been able to find, this is kind of similar, I think, to the biomolecules and the soft tissues. But I read that they're able to extract microorganisms and bacteria from amber and other materials, and that actually yeast was extracted from amber and used to brew beer. So if it was used to brew beer, it had to be living yeast, right? Because of the chemical reaction. So if we can find even like living bacteria that are supposed to be millions of years old, I feel like that kind of calls into question how old they're supposed to be, right?
Oh, exactly. So the yeast that they recovered was about 40 million years old.
Okay.
And one of the scientists actually took one of those strains and created his own line of beer that he so he used the yeast to actually brew beer, and it was kind of a novelty. And so, yeah, so why is the yeast alive and doing well and fine? So yeast is actually kind of a complex microbe. It's a eukaryotic microbe.
What does that mean?
It means it has a nucleus and
Okay.
it has chromosomes like say plants and animals.
I, of course, knew that. I was just asking for everybody
Right.
else.
So anyways, that's pretty exciting. That was evolutionists claim that those finds were about 40 million years old, which is pretty old. And obviously what's the yeast doing alive and well in those amber fossils? But they've actually found bacteria in salt inclusions in sedimentary rocks, which makes a lot of sense because the flood was a marine flood. It involved the oceans, and that's why we see ocean creatures at literally every level of the fossil record. Ocean creatures actually mixed in with land creatures. You know, sharks are buried with dinosaurs. That's just one example of many. We see seashells at almost every level of the geological column.
On top of Mount Everest or something, right?
And
Yeah.
so marine mixing was just a fact of the global flood. So not only are creatures being buried sequentially based on where they live, we call it ecological zonation, but you're getting marine mixing going on. So anyways, back to the bacteria. So these bacteria were found in salt inclusions, which is just basically marine water pockets in the sedimentary rocks that's still present. And they pulled these bacteria out and were able to reculture them, and they basically were alive and well. And they were considered to be 250 million years old.
Wow.
So how are bacteria living 250 million years in these salt inclusions? Well, it doesn't really make any sense. But if you look at the global flood where they were buried about 4,500 years ago, it makes perfect sense.
So, for reference, how long would a typical, I'm sure it varies, but how long would a typical bacteria survive?
Well, bacteria are pretty diverse and they're pretty hardy. At least certain types are very hardy and tough. So I can't really answer that directly,
Okay.
but 250 million years is really
Is
pushing
beyond.
pushing the spectrum
Okay.
for these bacteria to be alive and well.
Okay. So, what do they say about these bacteria and this yeast? How do evolutionists try to explain this away, we'll say?
I don't know that they have. Once again, they say, "Oh, it's an anomaly." I guess we were wrong. I guess these creatures can live for millions of years in these fossils, and so the problem is we're dealing with a presuppositional worldview. So
Right.
if your worldview is there is no God or that we all evolved from pond scum, It doesn't matter what the evidence says. You're just going to go with the flow and call it an anomaly or whatever. So, we've reached out on college campuses quite a bit the past few years here at ICR and talked with lots of students and faculty. And when someone is set in their ways and their worldview is evolutionary and anti-God, unless the Lord really moves upon them and draws them and opens their eyes, it's very difficult to get through.
Right. Because you think that at some point, eventually, they would say, "Oh, there's so many anomalies. Maybe something's wrong with our general belief system," right?
Well, exactly, and we're seeing the same thing in the evolutionary community as far as the evolutionists that are trying to put a model of evolution out there. And so there's been this huge schism, if you will, because there's many evolutionists now are saying, mutation selection, it's a failed paradigm. We don't see evidence of it. We see all this amazing evidence of creatures being driven by internal systems. They respond to their environment and they adapt accordingly. But yet we don't want to believe in a creator. We just need more data, is what they say. Or we an extended evolutionary synthesis. And actually, there's a website I think it's called the thirdwayofevolution.org, where it lists gobs of scientists. I don't know how many, but it's got one page on the website where it's just scientist after scientist signing on to this agenda to where they think they need to find some way out of the fix that they're in, because natural selection and mutation is not the answer, obviously.
Gotcha. It's not working.
It's not working, but yet they won't, on the other hand, acknowledge that there is a creator that created everything.
Okay. Well,
and it's the power of a worldview, really.
They're locked in.
They're locked in, and I worked at a major university for almost 20 years, and I know how people in academia think, and they are literally locked in. It's like a religion to them. It literally is. It's the religion of evolution, and it doesn't matter how much evidence there is against it. They're locked into their system.
This has been a lot of heavy science, and I'd like to just take a step back. Let's take a breath, and let's have our random science question of the day, okay?
All right.
All right.
We'll give it a go.
We'll give it a go. Okay. I know that everyone has this question. I know I had this question when I was a little kid, when I first saw Jurassic Park. So this is going to be, I'm going to take whatever you say as gospel. No, I'm just kidding. No. Here's the question. Is it possible to clone dinosaurs from DNA like in Jurassic Park? And if it's not possible now, would it be possible in the future, seeing as how we can clone like sheep and other living creatures today, sort of? Your answer.
Well, the problem is DNA in dinosaur fossils, it is present. They have proved that there is chromatin material in there, which is chromosomal material. In dinosaur fossils, actually, I think Mary Schweitzer was the one that did that. She developed antibodies that lit up DNA in dinosaur fossils. But the problem is it's very degraded. It's all broken up and busted up. And so that's a huge problem. So you can't clone anything where you've got all these little fragments and you don't know how to put them back together. I guess you could do DNA sequencing on it, although evolutionists won't sequence dinosaur DNA because I think it would make them look bad. Even though it's there, they won't sequence it. But the problem is it's all busted up, and so how do you put it back together to create real dinosaur chromosomes? And in cloning, you need living creatures, so you need a fertilized egg from a certain creature, and then you pull the nucleus out of that fertilized egg, and then you take the nucleus from another creature of the same kind or species. I'm not saying species is the definition of kind, but
right.
It has to be very closely related, and then you take the nucleus out of it's called a somatic cell, like a lung cell or whatever, and you stick that into the egg where you pulled the nucleus out of the enucleated egg, fertilized egg, and you stick that other nucleus in there from the other. So that's how they clone sheep, for example. And so you can't do that, obviously, with creatures that are fossilized and their DNA is all fragmented, and so it's impossible to do. Now, with the woolly mammoth, they are attempting to do something, but it's not necessarily cloning. So because the woolly mammoth genome is essentially an elephant genome, they're trying to take woolly mammoth DNA genes and then not clone those, but put those into a living elephant genome.
I did not know that.
And so, yes, and so it's not really cloning, so to speak. So they have technology now it's cut and paste. It's called the CRISPR-Cas system of genome modification. And so they're trying to insert woolly mammoth DNA into a modern elephant genome, just snippet by snippet, replacing genes. But really, it's the same genome. They're just trying to get woolly mammoth variants of certain genes and put them into a modern elephant genome.
Okay.
But it's not cloning. So,
not cloning.
Yeah,
se.
I don't really see that happening
Okay.
at any point in the near future.
Okay. Sorry, guys. No Jurassic Park, although that's probably a good thing considering what happened in the movies. Okay.
Well, I'll tell you how they claim they did it in the movie.
Okay.
They claim they used frog DNA to kind of stitch together all the dinosaur DNA fragments. So I think that was actually in the first Jurassic Park movie. They promoted that idea, but
So probably not possible.
it was just pure fiction.
Okay. Okay. Good to know. All right. Well, thank you for bearing with my ridiculous question. The answer was far more interesting than I anticipated. I didn't know they were doing that with the woolly mammoths. So that'll be interesting to see if we start having some woolly mammoth variants of elephants walking around at some point in the not too distant future. So, but we'll get back to the topic at hand. So we have so far two biological evidences of creation for a young Earth. We have the soft tissues and biomolecules in fossils, and we have the ancient microbes like yeast and
Right.
bacteria, et cetera. So the third one is a little bit different. Let's talk a little bit about the degeneration of the human genome. We know that with like each generation, they say that there's like 100 mutations between parent and child. I don't know the specifics, but I know that there are more mutations, and from my understanding, they're not good. So can we talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So John Sanford has actually modeled the human genome, and he basically said, okay, I'll concede to all the evolutionary paradigms in this theoretical model. He basically said, okay, I'll use the mutation selection model, and the model of what they call neutral evolution, the neutral model of evolution. Suffice it to say, John Sanford basically used the evolutionary paradigm in a computer model and showed that it was a failure, and that essentially these bad mutations could not be removed, or these neutral mutations could not be removed with theoretical models of selection. So really, having said all that, basically the human genome is devolving based on those computer models that John Sanford and his computer scientists and statisticians put together and published numerous papers, including papers in secular journals. And so he showed that really evolution was a failed system and that the human genome was devolving over time. Well, that's all fine and good, but that's just theoretical computer modeling. But what really got me excited was two papers that were published in 2012. And these papers sequenced the protein coding regions of humans, thousands of humans in North America and Europe, two different papers. One was published in Nature, the other in Science. And so these were top-tier journals. Mm-hmm. And so they call these protein coding segments of the human genome exomes. And so they sequenced the exomes of thousands of people. And they looked at those DNA sequences and found that over 80% of the mutations in those exomes that they called rare variants or rare variations were not good. They were associated with heart disease, with diabetes, with cancer, all sorts of human ailments and health problems. So in other words, mutations in these protein coding regions were for the most part very detrimental, although because you have two sets of chromosomes, a lot of times, the good gene on the other chromosome compensates for the bad gene on the other one. So anyways, while these mutations were associated with bad health, obviously the people were still alive. But anyways, they actually modeled these mutations using a population demographics model that was very realistic. They didn't use their standard evolutionary models that were calibrated with millions of years or deep time. They actually looked at how fast populations grow, the generation times of people, and they used actual realistic, global demographic data, and then put that model of variation within these protein coding regions into that model. And they literally said that the human genome, based on the rare variants that they saw, was only 5,000 to 10,000 years old.
Which fits in with what we see in the Bible.
Yeah, right. What's crazy is that they claimed before that it just flatlined. Well, I about fell out of my chair in my office when I read these papers.
I think I heard that. No.
Yeah, because it's like, that fits perfectly with people descending from three breeding couples that survived the flood.
Right.
Noah's sons and their three sons and their wives. Mm-hmm. And so the variation that we see actually in the human genome, the real empirical variation, points directly to a time frame of the global flood. And there's been other studies that have been done. Robert Carter, a geneticist, has actually looked at the mitochondrial DNA. So outside the nucleus, you have these little energy factories called mitochondria. And each one of those has its own piece of circular DNA. It's about 15,000 DNA letters long. And you could actually look at the variation in the mitochondrial DNA as well. And you can use empirical models and see how old the mitochondrial genome is. And Robert Carter has shown that it's about 6,000 years old. So that would be the ancestral Eve genome, because we inherit our mitochondria in our cells from our mothers.
And we know from Scripture who that mother was.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that in the late 1990s, there was a secular conventional study done by scientists that actually looked at the variation in the mitochondrial genome, and they said that the mitochondrial genome, based on their empirical data, they didn't do all the evolutionary calibration that's very common. They said also that the mitochondrial genome was about 7,000 years old.
Close enough, right?
And of course, it caused all kinds of backlash.
Right.
And I think it was published in Science is where that was published, and then after that, all the evolutionists began freaking out and sending letters into the editor saying this can't be so. But it's hard data, it's empirical data, and it's real. And so the science we're getting out of the human genome or the mitochondrial genome is pointing to a biblical timeline. And I've actually published articles on this where I list all of the studies and the papers and things.
For sure. Well, as a small aside to that, before we close, I'm curious, maybe this is a little bit of a dark question, but if our genome is quote unquote devolving, how much longer does the human race have theoretically?
Well, some evolutionists have commented that they're surprised we're not extinct.
Okay.
Because we are building up mutations over time. The human genome is not evolving and getting better. It's devolving and losing information, and information is becoming more and more corrupt as humanity progresses down the timeline of history. And so, but you also have to remember that God has put a lot of mechanisms in our genome to repair and to edit and to keep things functioning. So in computer science, we call these systems fault tolerant.
Okay.
So in other words, you have backup systems that will keep your computer network going in case of some crisis. Maybe you lose some servers or whatever. So the human genome does have a lot of fault tolerance machinery and programming and things in it to keep it moving along despite the degeneration that we're seeing. So, it's hard to say how long we have.
But
biologically,
we're not
biologically speaking,
right.
we could make some eschatological comments.
That's a different
that,
podcast. Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Thank you for answering that question. I was just curious. Okay. Let's take these 3 biological evidences. We have soft tissues, ancient microbes, and the degeneration of the human genome.
Right.
We want to make sure that our viewers and listeners are well educated. And so I know that there have been in the past, historically, there have been some creation arguments that we just don't use today. We either found out that they were incorrect or we were, not fully informed on anything. Have you heard any faulty creationist arguments on any one of these topics that you would just recommend that our viewers and listeners not use?
No, I think all 3 that we've discussed today are valid.
Okay.
They're solid. They're supported by conventional science, published in conventional scientific journals, or some people use the term secular.
You're right.
Non-Christian or non-creationist journals. Most of this information has been published in. It didn't necessarily make the headlines. Some of it did. But we have discussed it in our writings. We have cited these publications and then digested the material down to where it's kind of at a lay level where people can understand it. So I've got a number of articles touching on these topics that we've discussed today.
Okay, so we have free reign to use these in
Absolutely,
arguments going
yes,
forward.
yeah.
Awesome, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Of course, this is part 1, so we are about to, a little behind the scenes, we're about to record part 2, but for our viewers and listeners, we urge you to stick around and listen to some more biological evidences for a young Earth. Thank you all so much for being here and for watching and listening. We encourage you to like, subscribe, send this to a friend, send this to your family, share it on Facebook or whatever your social media of choice is. But we'll see you on the next episode of the Creation Podcast, and y'all have a wonderful day.